The man who urged us to keep on rocking in the free world has called for the silencing of Joe Rogan and started such a storm that Rogan and Spotify have chosen to respond. Coming up next on Techshark. Welcome to Techshark, bite-sized news for conservatives surfing the net. To get you up to speed, world-famous podcaster Joe Rogan interviewed medical professionals who questioned shifting narratives around the COVID-19 pandemic. Since then, questionably relevant rocker Neil Young pulled his music from Spotify in protest, causing Spotify and Rogan to respond. Rogan released a video on his Instagram that could be described as a non-apology to the people offended by so-called misinformation in his podcast interviews.
The problem I have with the term misinformation, especially today, is that many of the things that we thought of as misinformation just a short while ago are now accepted as fact. Like, for instance, 8 months ago, if you said, if you get vaccinated, you can still catch COVID and you can still spread COVID, you would be removed from social media. They would ban you from certain platforms. Now, that's accepted as fact. If you said, I don't think cloth masks work, you would be banned from social media. Now, that's openly and repeatedly stated on CNN. If you said, I think it's possible that COVID-19 came from a lab, you'd be banned from many social media platforms. Now, that's on the cover of Newsweek. All of those theories that at one point in time were banned were openly discussed by those two men that I had on my podcast that have been accused of dangerous misinformation.
Rogan also defended the guests he hosted and noted that he would accept disclaimers on his podcasts about COVID-19 going forward. So this all began last week when Young issued an ultimatum to Spotify threatening to withdraw his music. Young complained on his website, attempting to explain his rationale for the ultimatum to Spotify. He suggested that Spotify merely allowing famous podcasters to have open conversations about the pandemic was engaging in some kind of moral hazard. Most of the listeners hearing the unfactual, misleading, and false COVID information on Spotify are 24 years old, impressionable, and easy to swing to the wrong side of the truth. These young people believe Spotify would never present grossly unfactual information. They unfortunately are wrong. I knew I had to try to point that out. Now here's the shark bite. At this point in time, Rogan is more rock and roll than all the washed-up sellouts complaining about his podcast. I saw some outlets claiming that Rogan had made some massive apology or caved, but I honestly think he played his cards right. He used this opportunity to completely skewer the hypocrisy on so-called misinformation. He accepted disclaimer labels, which honestly mean nothing nowadays. But I really want to get into the absurd hypocrisy of the guy who started this mess, Neil Young. Before this week, I had little to no idea who Neil Young is. When I was asking around the office for info about him, I found out he went on a freedom of speech tour during the Bush presidency. A freedom of speech tour. Now he's calling to cancel Joe Rogan. I saw this meme mocking him for having gone from singing Rockin' in the free world to advocating cancel culture. And it really got me thinking, what's the point of rock and roll now? When hippies and old rockers talked about freedom, was it just about the freedom to enjoy drugs and hookup culture? What happened to riding free, owning your fate, speaking the dangerous truth? Censorship, being embraced by musicians who sang about freedom, is a lot like March for Science people embracing unscientific transgender dogma. It's so crazy to me how short a time it took for all the people who were anti-establishment to embrace the establishment. Liberals who accused the US of war crimes in the 2000s embraced John McCain and George W. Bush in the Trump era. What do they believe in exactly, aside from bourgeois respectability and hating working-class conservatives? If you want a real rebellion of ideas against a bad system, you won't find it among the sellout artists who pitch revolution as a means to market their brand. You'll find it among freethinkers like Rogan, who actually challenge us to open our minds. You can evaluate how terrified the liberal media seems about them as proof. You want to believe there are sort of checks and balances, so when you see a complete lack of genuine rebels in society, it's kind of scary. I thought it was hilarious in December when the frontman of Skillet called out rock band Rage Against the Machine for basically supporting the liberal establishment, labeling them government rock. I think that's a really good term. Government rock. I mean, we saw both Lady Gaga and Billie Eilish endorse President Joe Biden, for goodness sake. I was a daily listener to shock jock radio legend Howard Stern through my high school and college years. His old segments are still hilarious, but today, many agree he's kind of lost that edge that made him lock horns with the FCC for free speech. That politically incorrect and irreverent edge that many found so offensive also made him rise to popularity in the first place. As wokeness and cancel culture rose in the 2010s, every comedian, every performer was given a choice. You can keep being edgy and real if you're willing to be condemned by high society, or you can sell out and be seen as one of the respectable sources. The problem for liberals is that while their views have gotten more and more radical, human nature stays the same. Normal people still want what they want. That, more or less, is why Rogan is so wildly popular, because he fills the void of all the fake rebels who sold out. Americans, real Americans, still want a free thinker who's willing to tell it like it is or ask the uncomfortable questions we're all thinking. Journalist Bari Weiss wrote in her opinion piece for the New York Times called "Joe Rogan is the New Mainstream Media" that liberal-dominated media go out of their way to alienate common men while Rogan inspires them. While GQ puts Pharrell gowned in a yellow sleeping bag on the cover of its new masculinity issue, introduced by the editor explaining that the men's magazine isn't really trying to be exclusively for or about men at all, Joe Rogan swings kettlebells and bow hunts elk. So when Neil Young sings stuff like "Old Man, Look at My Life," maybe he ought to look himself in the mirror and ask what he and many of his fellow artists have allowed themselves to become. Because I'd argue right now that Joe Rogan and people like him are the ones actually rocking in the free world. Thanks for watching Techshark, brought to you by MRC-TV and Free Speech America. Have a good week.